May 26, 1942. Dawn. The sun rises over the Libyan desert like a furnace door opening onto hell. The sky bleeds crimson, then gold, then white-hot as the temperature climbs. Across the scarred wasteland west of Tobruk, the air already shimmers with heat that will soon reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. In the British defensive positions stretching south from Gazala on the Mediterranean coast, men wake to the taste of sand in their mouths, the metallic tang of fear on their tongues, and the distant rumble of engines that has not ceased for 3 days. The sound is different this morning, deeper, more certain. Inside a Grant tank of the 4th Armored Brigade, Corporal James Whitmore from Sussex pours lukewarm tea from a canteen, his hands trembling slightly. He does not yet know that within 72 hours his brigade will cease to exist. That the carefully constructed defensive line his commanders have assured him is impregnable will collapse like a house of cards. That the largest British defeat since Singapore is about to unfold in this God-forsaken stretch of North African sand. But Lieutenant General Erwin Rommel knows. 30 kilometers to the west, the commander of the Africa Corps stands in the cupola of his command vehicle, field glasses pressed to his eyes, watching the dust clouds raised by his mechanized columns. He has slept perhaps 4 hours in the last 2 days. His face is burned dark by the desert sun, creased with exhaustion, yet his eyes burn with the intensity of a man who sees not what is, but what will be. In his mind, the battle is already won. The Gazala line, that 40-mile chain of fortified boxes and minefields the British have spent months constructing, is already broken. Tobruk, the port that has resisted him once before, is already his. He does not yet know he is right. History records what happened next with clinical precision. The Battle of Gazala, May 26 to June 21, 1942.
A stunning German victory that captured 33,000 British and Commonwealth prisoners, destroyed over 500 British tanks, and delivered Tobruk, with its vital port facilities, supply depots, and 2,000 tons of fuel, into Axis hands. Field Marshal Claude Auchinleck's 8th Army retreated in disorder all the way to El Alamein, barely 60 miles from Alexandria, with Egypt and beyond it, the Suez Canal and the Middle Eastern oil fields hanging by a thread. But history also records what did not happen, that despite the magnitude of the disaster, substantial British forces escaped the encirclement, that Auchinleck managed to establish a new defensive line at El Alamein, that Rommel's Africa Corps, stretched to the breaking point by its own success, finally ground to a halt against hastily prepared defenses in July 1942, its supply lines impossibly extended, its fuel tanks nearly empty, its strength dissipated by the very momentum that had carried it so far so fast. What history has not recorded, what exists only in the realm of military what-ifs and strategic nightmares, is what would have happened if Rommel had achieved not merely victory at Gazala, but complete victory. If the British 8th Army had not merely retreated in disorder, but been utterly destroyed. If those 33,000 prisoners had been 100,000. If the careful balance of forces that allowed Britain to stabilize the front at El Alamein had tipped just a few degrees further into the abyss. This is the story of that unraveling, of how a victory becomes an annihilation, of how strategic overconfidence meets tactical brilliance, and an empire's grip on the Middle East slips through its fingers like desert sand. To understand how close Britain came to total catastrophe in North Africa, and how much closer it could have come, one must first understand the fundamental asymmetry that defined the entire Mediterranean theater.
A paradox that British commanders never fully grasped, even as it shaped every engagement, every decision, every disaster from 1940 to 1943. For Germany, North Africa was always a sideshow, a distraction, a commitment made reluctantly to shore up a failing Italian ally, prosecuted with minimal resources, always secondary to the great ideological crusade unfolding on the Eastern Front. At the height of the North African campaign, Germany never deployed more than 4 divisions to the theater, compared to the 150 divisions locked in combat with the Soviet Union. The Africa Corps received perhaps 5% of Germany's total military production. Fuel shipments were erratic, ammunition chronically short, reinforcements a trickle rather than a flood. And yet, for 2 years, this force, never numbering more than 100,000 German soldiers, supported by Italian divisions of widely varying quality, fought the British Empire to a standstill and beyond. Rommel's reputation as the Desert Fox was not mere propaganda. From March 1941, when he first arrived in Libya, until November 1942, when Montgomery finally defeated him at El Alamein, the Africa Corps won victory after victory against numerically superior British forces. Battle group tactics, aggressive reconnaissance, the bold use of anti-tank guns in offensive roles, the willingness to take risks that made British commanders blanch, these tactical innovations allowed German forces to consistently punch above their weight. But tactics can only compensate for strategic weakness to a point, and Germany's strategic position in North Africa was fundamentally untenable. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every replacement soldier had to cross the Mediterranean from Italian ports, running a gauntlet of British submarines, aircraft, and surface raiders operating from Malta. In 1941, Axis shipping losses averaged 20%. In 1942, as British forces on Malta intensified their operations, losses climbed above 30% in some months.
The mathematics were brutal and inexorable. For every 3 supply ships that left Naples or Toronto, 1 never reached Tripoli. The British, by contrast, could supply their forces in Egypt via the long but secure route around the Cape of Good Hope. Convoys might take weeks rather than days, but they arrived. American tanks, delivered under Lend-Lease, flowed into Egypt in quantities that seemed miraculous to Axis intelligence officers. By mid-1942, the material disparity was staggering. British forces in Egypt possessed more than twice as many tanks as Rommel, a 3-to-1 advantage in artillery, and near total air superiority. Under these circumstances, British defeat should have been impossible. German victory should have been unthinkable. And yet, the defensive line that Lieutenant General Neil Ritchie's 8th Army had constructed west of Tobruk represented Britain's attempt to apply overwhelming material advantage to create an impregnable position. The Gazala line stretched 40 miles from the coast south into the desert, anchored by a series of fortified boxes, brigade-sized positions ringed with minefields and barbed wire, garrisoned by infantry with artillery support, designed to be mutually supporting strongpoints that would channel any German attack into killing zones where British armor could destroy it. On paper, it was sound. In reality, it was a monument to the institutional weaknesses that had plagued British armored warfare since the war's beginning. The boxes were too far apart, some separated by 5 or 10 miles of empty desert. Radio communications were unreliable. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery remained abysmal, hampered by doctrinal confusion and inter-service rivalry. British tank tactics still emphasized the cavalry charge, the spirit of élan, the belief that British pluck and courage could overcome German professionalism and preparation.
Tank crews routinely attacked enemy positions without infantry support, without reconnaissance, often without even coordinating between different tank units. Again and again, British armor had charged German anti-tank gun screens and been slaughtered. They had learned nothing from these disasters. At Gazala, they would repeat every mistake, pay for every lesson in blood, and still not understand what killed them. On May 26th, Rommel struck, not against the Gazala line itself, but around it, in a wide, sweeping movement that took his mobile forces, the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, the 90th Light Division, and Italian armored units, south around the Free French position at Bir Hakeim, then northeast to strike at the rear of the British defenses. It was a classic Rommel maneuver, bold, risky, predicated on speed and confusion, betting everything on the inability of British commanders to react quickly to a rapidly changing tactical situation. For the first 48 hours, it seemed the gamble had failed. British armor, alerted to the flanking movement, converged on the German columns. Fierce tank battles erupted in the desert south of the Knight's Bridge box. The 15th Panzer Division, low on fuel and ammunition, found itself pinned against the British minefields with its back to the defensive positions it had hoped to attack from the rear. Losses mounted. Ammunition ran critically low. For one of the few times in his career, Rommel faced the prospect of complete operational failure, his best units trapped and destroyed by the very audacity that usually brought him victory. What saved him was not German superiority, but British incompetence. Rather than coordinating their attacks to crush the trapped German forces, British armored brigades attacked piecemeal, independently, often without even informing each other of their intentions. The 4th Armored Brigade attacked from the east. Hours later, the 22nd Armored Brigade attacked from the south.
Neither assault was supported by infantry or artillery. Both ran headlong into German anti-tank gun screens, the feared 88mm guns, originally designed as anti-aircraft weapons, used in ground roll with devastating effect. British tanks brewed up by the dozens. Commanders who should have been coordinating the largest armored battle yet fought instead operated in isolation, guided by doctrine that emphasized individual initiative over systematic cooperation. By May 28th, Rommel had turned impending disaster into opportunity. His forces had blasted a gap through the minefields, establishing a defensive position that British veterans would grimly dub the Cauldron, a pocket protected by German anti-tank guns and minefields, from which Rommel could sortie against British positions while keeping his forces concentrated. For the next 2 weeks, British commanders hurled attack after attack against the Cauldron, trying to crush the German position before Rommel could break out. Each attack followed the same pattern: inadequate reconnaissance, poor coordination, armor attacking with infantry support, units committed to battle piecemeal rather than in overwhelming strength. Each attack was bloodily repulsed. By June 11th, when Rommel finally broke out of the Cauldron and began rolling up the Gazala line from south to north, British armor had been reduced to smoking wreckage. The 150th Brigade box fell after fierce resistance. The Free French at Bir Hakeim, surrounded and pounded by German artillery and Stuka dive bombers, evacuated on June 10th after a defense that won Rommel's admiration. One by one, the boxes fell or were evacuated as the defensive line collapsed. On June 21st, Tobruk surrendered after a 30-hour battle. The garrison of 35,000 South African, Indian, and British troops marched into captivity, along with vast supply depots that Rommel's quartermaster could scarcely believe. 2,000 tons of fuel, 5,000 tons of food.
Ammunition, vehicles, spare parts, everything the Afrika Korps needed for its next advance, delivered intact by an enemy too confused and demoralized to destroy what it could not defend. It was a catastrophe of the first order, but it was not a complete catastrophe. 8th Army, though defeated and demoralized, had not been destroyed. Perhaps 70,000 troops retreated east in varying degrees of order and disorder. Tanks continued to trickle in from workshops in Egypt. Auchinleck sacked Ritchie, took personal command, and established a new defensive line at El Alamein, where the desert narrowed between the Mediterranean and the impassable Qattara Depression, giving the British the concentrated defense they had failed to achieve at Gazala. When Rommel struck at El Alamein in July, he found his exhausted, undersupplied forces unable to break through. The First Battle of El Alamein, a grinding, inconclusive slugging match, ended German hopes of reaching the Suez Canal. By August, the front had stabilized. In October, Montgomery, Auchinleck's replacement, would launch the Second Battle of El Alamein with overwhelming material superiority, breaking Rommel's line and beginning the long retreat that would end in Tunisia in May 1943. This is the history we know, the narrow escape, the disaster that could have been worse but wasn't. But in war, disasters have a way of compounding. Mistakes beget mistakes. Institutional weaknesses, exposed but not addressed, create cascading failures, and the difference between a major defeat and an apocalyptic one can turn on decisions made in hours, even minutes, by commanders who do not yet know they are balanced on a knife's edge. What if Rommel's intelligence had been slightly better? What if British incompetence had been slightly worse?
What if the 21st Panzer Division had cut the coast road before the bulk of 8th Army could retreat? What if Gazala had become not merely a defeat, but an encirclement?
Not merely a disaster, but an annihilation? June 14, 1942. Alternative timeline. The reconnaissance report reaches Rommel's headquarters at 0430 hours, transmitted from a motorcycle patrol of the 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion that has penetrated 30 kilometers behind British lines. The message is terse, fragmented by poor radio conditions, but the intelligence it contains electrifies every officer in the command vehicle. British armor withdrawing east along Coast Road and Column, no flank security. Estimate 2 brigade strength, heavy vehicles, moving slow. Rommel studies the map by flashlight, his mind racing through calculations of time and distance, fuel and ammunition, risk and opportunity. The main body of British armor, what remains of it after 2 weeks of grinding battle, is retreating toward Tobruk, hoping to regroup behind the port's defenses or perhaps evacuate by sea. They are moving in column, strung out along the single coast road, exhausted and demoralized after the collapse of the Gazala line. They are vulnerable. In our timeline, Rommel chose to pursue methodically, reducing the remaining British positions at Gazala before turning his full attention to Tobruk. It was the cautious decision, the sound decision. His forces were exhausted, his supply situation precarious. Better to consolidate his gains, bring up supplies and reinforcements, than strike at Tobruk from a position of strength. But Rommel had not become the desert fox by being cautious. His entire career, his every success, had been built on the willingness to take calculated risks that more conservative commanders would reject, to strike when the enemy expected consolidation, to advance when doctrine demanded pause, to trust his instinct that a beaten enemy, if given time to recover, becomes dangerous again, but a beaten enemy pursued relentlessly can be destroyed. He makes his decision in less than 5 minutes.
The 21st Panzer Division, his most reliable formation, is to break off from the reduction of the 2nd South African Division at the Knightsbridge Box. It will drive northeast at maximum speed, cutting across the rear of the retreating British column to block the coast road between Gazala and Tobruk. The 15th Panzer Division will continue pressing the South Africans while simultaneously sending a Kampfgruppe to pursue the British retreat directly. The Italian Ariete Division and 90th Light will follow up, encircling any British forces that fail to break through the roadblock. It is a classic Kesselschlacht, a cauldron battle, an encirclement, the preferred German tactical solution since the campaigns in France and Russia. But in our timeline, it was never attempted at Gazala because the window of opportunity never quite opened wide enough. British forces retreated just quickly enough, just cohesively enough to stay ahead of potential encirclement. In this timeline, British incompetence runs slightly deeper, communications failures slightly worse, command confusion slightly more profound. At 0600 hours, the 21st Panzer Division begins its movement. 150 tanks, 2 motorized infantry regiments, anti-tank guns, artillery, all the supporting elements of a German Panzer Division at the height of its effectiveness. The division commander, General Georg von Bismarck, drives his forces mercilessly. Tanks that break down are abandoned. Vehicles running low on fuel are towed by others. The column raises a dust plume visible for miles, but there are no British reconnaissance aircraft to spot it. RAF units, reeling from the collapse of their forward airfields, are in the process of evacuating east. The skies belong to the Luftwaffe. By 1400 hours, advanced elements of the 21st Panzer have reached the coast road, 15 kilometers west of Tobruk. Behind them, strung out in a 50-kilometer column, comes the main body of the division.
And behind them, 30 kilometers to the west, comes the leading edge of the retreating British column. The trap is closing. Major Geoffrey Harwell, commanding the lead squadron of the 8th Royal Tank Regiment, first realizes something is catastrophically wrong when his column rounds a low ridge and finds German tanks dug in across the road ahead. For a moment, his mind refuses to process what his eyes are seeing. German forces should be behind them, not in front. The road to Tobruk should be open. This should not be possible.
But the muzzle flashes that erupt from the German positions are undeniably real. The first salvo kills 4 British tanks before Harwell can even issue orders. His squadron scatters off the road, trying to deploy from column into line, but there is no room to maneuver. The coastal plain here is barely 3 kilometers wide between the sea and the rocky escarpment. German anti-tank guns have commanding positions on the high ground. German armor is deployed in depth, waiting. It is not a battle. It is a shooting gallery. Behind Harwell's squadron, the British column bunches up like cars in a traffic jam. Tanks, lorries, armored cars, artillery tractors, all compressed into an immobile mass on a single road with no room to deploy, no way to retreat, and no possibility of advancing. German artillery, called in by forward observers, begins dropping shells into the densest concentrations. Within 30 minutes, the coast road has become a twisted monument to mechanized warfare's vulnerability when mobility is lost. Some British units try to break through by force, charging the German positions in desperate frontal attacks. They die wholesale, their tanks torn apart by 88mm guns and Panzergranate anti-tank rounds at ranges where their own guns cannot effectively respond. Other units try to retreat back west, only to encounter the 15th Panzer Division's Kampfgruppe advancing from that direction.
By nightfall, approximately 40,000 British and Commonwealth troops are trapped in a pocket 15 kilometers long and 3 kilometers wide, pressed between the sea and the escarpment, under fire from German positions on 3 sides. In our timeline, this never happened. In this timeline, it is only beginning. The next 72 hours will be remembered, by those who survive to remember, as the Tobruk pocket, though the encirclement is actually centered 20 kilometers west of that port. It will be compared to Falaise, to Stalingrad, to every great encirclement battle of the war. But those comparisons, while dramatic, miss the essential truth of what unfolds in that narrow strip of desert between June 14th and June 17th. This is not an encirclement of unprepared troops caught by surprise, like the Polish armies in 1939 or the Soviet forces in the summer of 1941. The men trapped in the Tobruk pocket are veterans of 2 years of desert warfare. Many fought at Wavell's victory over the Italians in 1940-41. Some were besieged in Tobruk during Rommel's first offensive. They are not particularly well led. The institutional failures that plagued British armored warfare remain acute, but they are experienced, resilient, and equipped with weapons equal or superior to those the Germans possess. Under other circumstances, they might hold out for days or even weeks, might organize a coherent defense, establish a perimeter, wait for relief or evacuation by sea. But circumstances are not kind. The pocket has been formed not through deliberate German planning, but through opportunistic exploitation of British confusion. There is no prepared defensive position, no stockpiled supplies, no organized command structure. Units are intermixed. Tank regiments are separated from their support echelons. Artillery batteries have no ammunition supply beyond what their tractors carry.
There is no water except what men have in their personal canteens and the few water trucks scattered through the pocket. Most critically, there is almost no fuel. The tanks and vehicles that reached the point of encirclement did so on the last drops in their tanks, expecting to refuel at Tobruk. Now they sit immobilized, steel coffins baking in the desert sun. German artillery begins systematic bombardment at first light on June 15th. Not the creeping barrage of the First World War, but precise, observed fire directed at concentrations of vehicles, at any attempt to organize defensive positions, at the few water points. Stuka dive bombers, freed from attacks on the now fallen Gazala positions, add their weight to the bombardment. The distinctive scream of their sirens, psychological warfare as much as explosive effect, echoes across the pocket every hour. There is no comparable British artillery to respond. Most guns are either out of ammunition or unable to obtain fire missions through the chaos of the collapsed command structure.
RAF fighters and bombers, staging from airfields in Egypt, attempt to interdict German positions, but they are too few, and the Luftwaffe's control of the airspace above the pocket too complete. German flat guns in place on the high ground take a steady toll. By the afternoon of June 15th, senior British officers trapped in the pocket understand that relief is not coming, not in time, not in strength. Auchinleck, taking personal command of the crisis from Cairo, has nothing to send. The remaining British armor in Egypt amounts to perhaps 80 operational tanks, nowhere near enough to break through German positions that are growing stronger by the hour as reinforcements and supplies arrive. The Royal Navy could potentially evacuate some troops by sea, but the pocket does not include any harbor facilities, and the beaches are under German artillery fire.
Destroyer captains, remembering the slaughter at Dunkirk and Crete, are reluctant to bring their ships in range without air superiority and defensive positions ashore. The pocket begins to collapse inward, not through German assault, but through its own internal contradictions. Men without water start surrendering in small groups. Isolated positions, out of ammunition, run up white flags. The perimeter shrinks kilometer by kilometer as German forces close in, not because they are pushing hard, but because there is no organized resistance to slow them. On June 16th, Rommel personally tours the front lines of the encirclement, assessing whether a final assault is necessary or whether the pocket will simply dissolve on its own. What he sees confirms his instinct. The British are finished. Their will to resist has been broken not by force of arms, but by the absolute hopelessness of their situation. They are dying of thirst in sight of the Mediterranean. They are burning in their tanks under the desert sun because they have no fuel to move and no weapons to fight. They are waiting, with the peculiarly British stoicism that Rommel has learned to respect, for the inevitable end. He orders assault groups to begin reducing the pocket systematically, sector by sector. Not a grand offensive, but a methodical elimination of resistance. Panzer grenadiers supported by tanks and combat engineers, moving through the compressed British positions, offering surrender to those who will take it, killing those who resist. It is ugly work, made uglier by the heat and the smell of burning vehicles and unwashed men, and the peculiar psychological cruelty of destroying an enemy who knows he is defeated but cannot escape. On June 17th, organized resistance ends. In our timeline, Tobruk fell on June 21st after a 30-hour battle with 35,000 prisoners.
In this timeline, the Tobruk pocket yields more than 70,000 prisoners over 3 days, 2 entire armored divisions, most of an infantry division, dozens of independent brigades and support units, the core of Britain's mechanized force in Egypt. The butcher's bill is staggering. 400 tanks destroyed or captured, 300 artillery pieces, 8,000 vehicles. Casualty figures will never be precisely known. Record-keeping breaks down in the chaos, but best estimates suggest 12,000 killed or wounded in the 3 days of the pocket, most from artillery and air bombardment, many from thirst and heat exhaustion. But the material losses, severe as they are, pale beside the strategic implications of what has just occurred. In our timeline, Britain's defeat at Gazala was a disaster that nonetheless left enough force in being to establish a new defensive line at El Alamein, to absorb reinforcements and replacements, to eventually go over to the offensive. In this timeline, the 8th Army has been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. What retreats to El Alamein is not a battered but coherent army, but a collection of remnants, administrative units, training cadres, rear echelon troops, perhaps 20,000 combat soldiers scraped together from survivors of units that no longer exist. Between this fragmented force and Rommel's Africa Corps, flushed with its greatest victory, stands almost nothing. Egypt, and beyond it, the Suez Canal, Palestine, Iraq, the Persian oil fields, lies essentially undefended. June 20th, 1942, Cairo. The city has not descended into panic, not quite, but the edge of hysteria is palpable. In the streets of the European quarter, British civilians queue outside banks to withdraw their savings, despite official assurances that the military situation remains under control.
Smoke rises from the British embassy as diplomats burn documents, classified and otherwise.
At Royal Air Force Headquarters, transport aircraft sit on the tarmac with engines running, ready to evacuate key personnel on an hour's notice. In the harbor at Alexandria, the Mediterranean fleet makes preparations to evacuate to ports in Palestine or East Africa if the situation deteriorates further. The situation is deteriorating. General Claude Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief Middle East Command, stares at the map in his operations room with the exhausted gaze of a man who has not slept properly in a week. The symbols marking British units have grown sparse, scattered across the western desert like seeds thrown on barren ground. The bold red arrows marking German advances seem to point directly at his heart. Tobruk has fallen. Not after the prolonged siege he expected, but in a matter of hours, its defenses shredded by German forces that attacked with the confidence of troops who know their enemy is beaten. The port, the supplies, the fuel, all of it now in Rommel's hands, feeding the advance that even now is pushing toward the frontier wire separating Libya from Egypt. In our timeline, Auchinleck managed to stabilize the front at El Alamein through a combination of desperate improvisation and the fact that 8th Army, though defeated, retained enough strength to man defensive positions. In this timeline, he confronts a fundamentally different calculus. He has perhaps 20,000 combat troops fit for immediate action. Another 30,000 are scattered between the frontier and El Alamein, logistics personnel, training units, rear area security forces, men who can hold a rifle but have little or no experience with the reality of mechanized warfare. Against this, intelligence estimates Rommel has 70,000 effectives, the Afrika Korps plus Italian divisions that are actually fighting well now that they see victory approaching, and momentum that seems unstoppable. The mathematics are brutal. Auchinleck is not a stupid man or a coward.
He understands that the El Alamein position, strong as it is on paper, requires troops to hold it, requires armor to counterattack German breakthroughs, requires artillery, ammunition, supplies, the 1,000 logistical threads that make a defensive line something more than colored pins on a map. He does not have these things, not in sufficient quantity, not in time. At 1800 hours on June 20th, he makes the most consequential decision of his career, a decision that in our timeline he never had to make because the situation never quite became this desperate, a decision that will define everything that follows. He orders the evacuation of forward positions and the establishment of a new defensive line, not at El Alamein, 60 miles from Alexandria, but at the Suez Canal itself. It is an admission that Egypt west of the canal cannot be held, that Cairo, Alexandria, the Nile Delta, 2,000 years of civilization and 3 million Egyptian civilians are to be conceded to Axis occupation. But it is also a recognition of reality. The canal can be held with the forces available, its banks can be fortified, its bridges can be demolished. Behind it, Palestine offers defense in depth, secure supply lines, time to rebuild shattered units, and absorb the reinforcements already in the pipeline from Britain and America. It is strategic retreat on a scale unprecedented in the Mediterranean theater. It is the abandonment of everything Britain fought for in North Africa over 2 years of grinding desert war. It is also, Auchinleck believes, the only way to prevent complete catastrophe, to trade space for time, to preserve the army even as the territory is lost. The evacuation order goes out that night. Military installations are to be demolished. Supply dumps that cannot be moved are to be destroyed. The Mediterranean fleet is to retire to Haifa. RAF units are to fall back to airfields in Palestine. The civilian British population is to be evacuated by any means available.
And to General Archibald Wavell, commanding British forces in India, goes an urgent request. Send everything you can as fast as you can. Infantry divisions, armor, supplies. Because if the canal is lost, if Rommel breaks through into Palestine, then the entire British position in the Middle East collapses. Iraq's oil is lost. Iran becomes untenable. The southern approach to the Soviet Union lies open. The global strategic situation,
already dire in this summer of 1942, with the Wehrmacht driving toward the Caucasus and Japanese forces threatening India, suddenly becomes existential. The symbol that would come to represent this transformation, the object that soldiers and historians would fixate on, was not a weapon or a flag, but a canteen. In our timeline, British troops at El Alamein grumbled about the heat and the flies and the monotony of tinned beef, but they always had water. The Nile was close. The logistics pipeline, though strained, functioned. Men drank their fill, washed when they could, knew that however bad things got, they would not die of thirst. In the Tobruk pocket, men watched their canteens empty under the merciless June sun and knew that relief was not coming. They rationed the last drops, traded cigarettes for a mouthful from a comrade's canteen, licked the condensation from metal surfaces at dawn. Some, driven mad by thirst, drank seawater from the Mediterranean and died in convulsing agony. Others surrendered, not because German guns compelled them, but because German soldiers had water. It became a recurring motif in the accounts of survivors, in the letters that made it past censors, in the nightmares that would haunt veterans for decades: the empty canteen, the cracked lips, the sun beating down like a physical assault, the choice between dying of thirst as a free man or drinking as a prisoner. And behind that immediate physical symbolism lay a deeper truth that British commanders were only beginning to confront.
The empty canteen represented the failure of Britain's entire logistical edifice in the Middle East, the assumption that superior numbers and shorter supply lines would inevitably prevail over German tactical brilliance, the belief that the Mediterranean was a British lake and North Africa a sideshow that could be managed with economy of force operations. These assumptions had always been questionable. Now they were revealed as catastrophically wrong. Rommel's troops, by contrast, drank captured British water from captured British supplies, fueled their vehicles with captured British petrol, ate captured British rations. The operational irony was perfect. The Africa Corps, chronically undersupplied from Europe, sustained its advance into Egypt by consuming the abundant material that American Lend-Lease had poured into British depots. Every mile Rommel advanced shortened his supply lines and lengthened Britain's. Every British defensive position he overran yielded the fuel and ammunition he needed to reach the next one. It was strategic jujitsu, turning British material advantage into the engine of British defeat. By late June, German mobile columns are probing toward the Suez Canal. The advance is slower than Rommel would like. His forces are exhausted, strung out, in desperate need of rest and refitting, but British resistance is minimal. Ad hoc defensive positions crumble after token resistance. Rearguards delay the German advance for hours, not days. Egyptian civilians, sensing the wind's direction, begin greeting German troops with the same cautious opportunism they showed the British. Cairo falls on July 3rd. There is no battle to speak of. The city has been largely evacuated of British military personnel. Egyptian authorities, uncertain whether the British will ever return, negotiate a tacit understanding with German liaison officers. The city will not resist. German forces will not engage in reprisals or large-scale occupation.
It is a fiction that benefits both sides. Rommel has neither the troops nor the inclination to garrison a city of 2 million. The Egyptians, their country occupied by Britain since 1882, see no particular reason to die defending an empire that never asked their permission to occupy them in the first place. The symbolism is devastating. Cairo, the largest city in Africa, the cultural heart of the Arab world, headquarters of British Middle East Command, falls to Axis forces without a shot fired. Newsreels film German soldiers posing in front of the pyramids, a propaganda coup that resonates from Casablanca to Baghdad. On July 9th, advance elements of the Africa Corps reach the Suez Canal at Ismailia. They find the bridges demolished, the eastern bank fortified, British artillery zeroed on every potential crossing point. The Mediterranean fleet has retired, but left monitors and gunboats to patrol the canal and support the defenders with naval gunfire. RAF fighters, staging from Palestine, contest the airspace with a ferocity born of desperation. The easy advance is over.
Auchinleck has accomplished what he set out to do, traded space for time, preserved the army, established a defensive line that can be held with available forces. But the cost is staggering. All of Egypt west of the canal is under Axis control. 400,000 British and Egyptian civilians are trapped behind enemy lines. The propaganda value of the conquest is immense, proof Hitler trumpets that the British Empire is hollow, that German arms are invincible, that the new order is ascendant. And the strategic implications ripple outward like shockwaves from an earthquake. In Moscow, where the summer offensive of 1942 is gathering momentum, Stalin receives reports of the canal's loss with cold fury. His understanding of strategy, while often warped by ideology, is acute on fundamentals.
He recognizes immediately that the collapse of the British position in Egypt fundamentally alters the geometry of the war. In our timeline, Germany's 1942 offensive in southern Russia aimed at the Caucasus oil fields from the north, driving toward Grozny and Baku through difficult mountain terrain against a Soviet force that fought with suicidal tenacity for every mile. That offensive, while initially successful, eventually ground to a halt at Stalingrad, bled white by Soviet resistance and overstretched supply lines. In this timeline, Axis control of Egypt creates the possibility, remote but conceivable, of a two-pronged advance on the Persian Gulf oil. Rommel driving east from the canal through Palestine and Iraq, German Army Group A driving south from the Caucasus through Iran. If these forces link up somewhere in Persia, the entire Soviet southern flank collapses. Turkey, neutral but watching carefully, may abandon its precarious neutrality and join the winning side. The Middle Eastern oil fields, British, American, and Soviet, fall under Axis control. Stalin does not believe this nightmare scenario will actually occur. He understands that Rommel's logistics are a disaster, that the Afrika Korps is at the absolute end of its tether, that sustaining an advance beyond the canal is probably impossible. But probably is not certainly, and Stalin has built his entire political career on eliminating possibilities before they become probabilities. He orders the Transcaucasian Front to prepare for a German drive into Iran, diverts divisions desperately needed for the defense of Stalingrad to secure the Soviet-Iranian border, sends urgent demands to Churchill via the irascible Soviet ambassador in London for Britain to do more, commit more, explain how they managed to lose an entire army when they had material superiority. Churchill has no good answers.
The loss of Egypt is personally devastating, a repudiation of his entire Mediterranean strategy, of his insistence that North Africa mattered, that Tobruk could be held, that one more offensive would crack Rommel's line. His political position, always contentious, comes under renewed assault. Parliamentary critics who argued for prioritizing home defense or a second front in France over adventures in the desert smell blood. There are calls for votes of no confidence, for government reshuffling, for explanation of how Britain managed to turn victory at Gazala into catastrophe at the canal. He survives, barely, but the political damage is severe and lasting. His relationship with Roosevelt, already strained by American reluctance to commit to Mediterranean operations, deteriorates further. The Americans, watching British defeat in Egypt, conclude that Britain is no longer capable of strategic initiative, that American manpower, American industry, American military leadership will have to carry the burden of defeating Germany. The Germany First strategy remains intact. The United States is committed to prioritizing the European theater over the Pacific, but the British role in that strategy is increasingly subordinated to American direction. Plans for Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa in November 1942, are canceled. If the British cannot hold Egypt with material superiority, American planners reason, there is little point in opening a new front in Morocco and Algeria. Better to focus on the direct route, a cross-channel invasion of France in 1943, using Britain as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, but relying primarily on American troops and American planning. British commanders protest that this underestimates the difficulty of cross-channel operations, that 1943 is too early, that insufficient shipping and landing craft exist for such an operation.
The Americans note that British estimates of German strength always seem to err on the side of requiring more time, more resources, more delay. The arguments grow heated, then bitter, opening rifts in the Anglo-American alliance that will persist for years. In the Suez Canal zone, through the hot summer and fall of 1942, a strange stalemate develops. Rommel's forces, exhausted and undersupplied, lack the strength to force a crossing against British defenses that grow stronger by the week. British forces, rebuilt around fresh divisions from India and tank shipments from America, lack the strength or the will to counterattack across the canal and reclaim Egypt. Artillery duels rumble across the water. Patrols clash in the Sinai. Sappers on both sides plant minefields and string wire. It resembles nothing so much as the Western Front in 1915. Positional warfare, grinding attrition, the industrialized killing that both sides thought they had left behind in the previous war. The German Sixth Army reaches Stalingrad in August and begins the battle that will become synonymous with Total War's horror. In our timeline, that battle occurred with the full weight of German logistical support behind it. In this timeline, supplies are diluted, not drastically, but measurably, by the need to sustain Rommel's forces at the canal. Those few thousand tons of fuel and ammunition diverted south may not seem significant in the context of the entire Eastern Front, but in a battle decided by the narrowest margins, every ton matters. In India, Japanese forces probe the Burmese-Indian frontier, and British commanders who might have reinforced that front instead find their divisions diverted to the Middle East. The defense of India grows more precarious. In the Atlantic, U-boat operations intensify as Donitz's submarines target convoys rounding the Cape of Good Hope en route to Palestine. In our timeline, those convoys delivered supplies to Egypt, relatively close to the Cape.
In this timeline, they must sail an additional 1,000 miles through U-boat-infested waters to reach Palestine. Losses mount. Every front is connected. Every defeat compounds. The loss of Egypt does not by itself lose the war. Britain and America are still vastly more powerful than Germany in aggregate terms, and the fundamental trajectory of the conflict remains Allied victory. But the path to that victory grows longer, bloodier, more uncertain. And in the immediate term, for men manning defensive positions along the canal in 110-degree heat, for civilians trapped in occupied Cairo, for planners in London and Washington trying to salvage a Mediterranean strategy from wreckage, the consequences are immediate and harsh. December 1942, Suez Canal Zone. Private Thomas Bennett, Durham Light Infantry, watches the sunrise over the eastern bank from his position in a reinforced dugout. He arrived in Egypt 3 months ago, fresh from training in Scotland, expecting to join the great offensive that would drive Rommel back across Libya and redeem British honor. Instead, he is manning a static defensive line that stretches for miles in both directions, a line that everyone understands may be attacked at any moment and almost certainly cannot be decisively broken. He has never seen Cairo, which lies 30 miles behind enemy lines, visible only as a smudge on the western horizon. He has never seen the pyramids that featured so prominently in the recruitment posters back home. What he has seen is the peculiar hell of positional warfare in the desert, the unrelenting heat, the flies, the sporadic shelling, the knowledge that German troops in positions sometimes less than 100 meters away are enduring the same misery. There is a story circulating through the trenches, one of those rumors that may or may not be true, but feels true enough that men repeat it.
Supposedly, in October, a small German patrol and a British patrol encountered each other at a water point in no man's land between the lines. Rather than fighting, they took turns filling canteens, an unspoken truce born of mutual recognition that water in this God-forsaken place mattered more than ideology. The story ends with both patrols returning to their lines, honor satisfied, thirst quenched. Bennett doesn't know if it happened, but he knows that he would do the same if given the chance.
because the real enemy is not the German soldier in the trench across the wire, but the sun and the sand and the grinding certainty that he is trapped in a war that has no resolution in sight. Behind him, in the camps and depots scattered through Palestine, British Empire forces are slowly rebuilding. 10th Army, a new formation created from the shattered remnants of 8th Army, plus fresh divisions from India, Australia, and Britain, is training for the offensive that everyone promises will come in 1943. American tanks arrive by the hundreds, supplies accumulate, plans are drawn, revised, drawn again. But everyone who lived through Gazala, who saw how quickly confidence can become catastrophe, understands that plans are not reality, that tactical brilliance can trump material superiority, that another disaster, one more collapse, might be the breaking point that turns British retreat into British rout. The empty canteen on Bennett's belt, kept as a talisman, a reminder, embodies both memory and prophecy. Memory of what happened when the desert proved less forgiving than doctrine assumed. Prophecy of what might yet happen if the lessons of that disaster are not truly learned. Across the canal, in a fortified position near Ismailia, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber of the 21st Panzer Division watches the same sunrise and thinks similar thoughts. He fought at Gazala. He fought in the Tobruk pocket.
He saw British armor destroyed, British prisoners marched into captivity by the tens of thousands, British positions overrun with a speed that seemed miraculous. He also sees, with the clear-eyed pragmatism of a professional soldier, that his division is exhausted, that replacements are not arriving in sufficient numbers, that every supply convoy from Tripoli is a gamble against British submarines and aircraft, that the advance that carried the Afrika Korps to the canal has reached its absolute limit. Germany has won the greatest victory of the Desert War, has conquered Egypt, captured more prisoners than fell at Stalingrad, demonstrated that tactical excellence can overcome material inferiority. And yet, the canal holds. The British line does not break. The war goes on. The intangible erosion of belief that British arms could prevail, that Commonwealth solidarity would hold, that the Empire's vast resources guaranteed eventual victory. Some historians, examining this timeline, would argue that it changes little, that Allied material superiority was so overwhelming that German tactical victories, however spectacular, only delayed the inevitable, that Rommel's forces could never have broken through the canal defenses in strength, could never have sustained an advance into Palestine, could never have reached the oil fields that were his ultimate strategic objective. They are probably right. Strategic logistics are pitiless, and Germany's logistical situation in North Africa was hopeless, regardless of tactical success. Every mile east lengthened supply lines that were already at breaking point. The Afrika Korps at the canal in this timeline is in many ways more vulnerable than it was at El Alamein in ours, further from its bases, more dependent on captured supplies, exposed to British counterattack from multiple directions. But wars are not won by logistics alone, any more than they are won by tactics alone. They are won by the interaction of material, morale, politics, and chance, by the decisions of men under stress, making choices with incomplete information and mortal consequences. At Gazala, in those last days of May 1942, British commanders made every possible wrong choice. They repeated mistakes that had been made before. They allowed institutional failures to override individual courage and material superiority. And they came within a hair's breadth of turning defeat into annihilation, catastrophe into apocalypse. That they escaped complete disaster owes something to the stubbornness of men who kept fighting even when situations were hopeless, something to the logistical exhaustion that limited German pursuit, something to simple luck, the random factors that are ever present in war but impossible to predict or control.
In another timeline, our timeline, we remember Gazala as a defeat but not a disaster, a setback but not a strategic revolution. El Alamein, 4 months later, redeems it. Montgomery's victory erases the memory of Ritchie's failure. The long retreat becomes the preamble to permanent advance. In this timeline,
Gazala casts a longer shadow. The disaster is too complete to be erased by subsequent victory, the loss of Egypt too symbolically profound to be treated as mere tactical defeat. The canal defense becomes the new national narrative, British steadfastness holding the line when all seemed lost, the Empire's last stand before the slow grinding advance that will eventually push Rommel back. Both narratives contain truth, both obscure as much as they reveal. The empty canteen remains, in both timelines, a reminder, not of any single battle or decision, but of the fragility that underlies all human endeavor, the recognition that confidence can become hubris, that superiority on paper means nothing in the chaos of actual combat, that the distance between victory and catastrophe can be measured in miles, hours, or a single patrol cutting a road at the moment when retreat becomes rout. The desert keeps its secrets. The men who fought there carried their memories through the rest of their lives, some with pride, some with trauma, most with a complex mixture neither word adequately captures. They understood, in ways that historians can only approximate, how close they came to the edge, how easily the war they knew could have become something worse. In the end, history records what happened, not what might have been. But in understanding how close we came to alternative futures, we grasp the contingency of our own, the recognition that the world we inherited was not inevitable, but the product of 10,000 decisions made by imperfect people under impossible circumstances. At Gazala, they stood at that precipice. In our timeline, they stepped back.
In this one, they fell forward, and the world that emerged from that fall, while not fundamentally different, bore scars that would never quite heal. The sun sets over the canal. The stars emerge, the same stars that shone on Tobruk and Gazala, and all the nameless battlefields of the Desert War. Somewhere, in both timelines, an old soldier touches an empty canteen and remembers.